evidence session for the Committee on Standards in Public Life. Before I introduce our witness for this session, a word about the committee and the review that we're currently undertaking. The Committee on Standards in Public Life was founded in 1994 by Sir John Major, then the Prime Minister, to advise on arrangements for upholding ethical standards of conduct across public life in the UK. The committee first articulated under Lord Nolan the 7 principles of public life: selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership, which set out the universal standards for conduct in public life. And we continue as a committee to own and promote those principles. We're not a regulator. We do not field complaints or comment on the outcome of individual cases, but rather we advise the Prime Minister and government of the day on the processes, procedure, and regulation in place to uphold high standards of conduct. And we also promote best practice in maintaining high standards within public sector organisations. In 2019, to mark the 25th anniversary of the establishment of the committee, we commissioned some academic research into the complex tapestry of standards bodies that has emerged over the last 25 years. And following that, we decided to launch a review analysing the strengths and weaknesses of our current standards arrangements. The committee has done this twice before, most recently with our report Standards Matter in 2013. And we're taking an overall look at how well ethical standards are upheld in public life, looking at potential gaps and weaknesses in our standards regulators, and we will also be producing some best practice guidance. This session is an opportunity to hear the views of Professor Tony Wright, formerly Labour MP for Cannock Chase and Chair of the Public Administration Select Committee, and now Professor of Government and Public Policy at UCL. We are hoping to talk to Tony about the ministerial code and standards regulation and his understanding of the best approaches to standard regulation in a liberal democracy. From the committee today, we have with us Lord Stunnell, who is one of our political members representing the Liberal Democrats. We have Dr. Jane Martin and Dame Shirley Pearce, 2 of our independent members. We are live streaming this session on the committee's YouTube channel, and I'd like to remind all who are watching that the committee is not asking about any recent or past cases, including any matters currently being examined in the courts. So first of all, welcome and thank you very much indeed for coming to give us evidence this afternoon. Could I start with a wide question, which is that as chairman of the Public Administration Select Committee some years ago, you described our standards regulators as constitutional watchdogs. What do you think is the role and importance of ethical standards in the constitution of a liberal democracy?
I think it's fundamental. I think the conduct of government in terms of ethics and integrity is absolutely fundamental to any system of government. So we need to take it seriously. You were giving a bit of history there. I remember vividly sitting in the House of Commons in 1994 when John Major announced in the context of all the sleaze allegations at the time, when John Major announced the formation of this committee on a standing basis. And I remember being in the taxi queue at the Commons that night, surrounded by a little group of Conservative members of Parliament who were foaming at the mouth at what had happened because they thought this was the end of everything. All their consultancies, all their extramural stuff was going to go. Standards were going to be brought in, and a question is whether that has proved to be the case. My overall view on this is that the formation of this committee in 1994 was the beginning of, and of course the committee was active in this process, was the beginning of, I would say, almost 20 years of tightening up of standards. We've had I think I've made a list somewhere of all the bodies that were created over that 20-year period. It was consensus that we had to increase accountability. I've called it somewhere an accountability explosion. And I think that is it. The question now, though, is, are we at a different point? And I think we are, because I mean, much of that depended upon a sort of consensus about standards, or about standards improvement and accountability strengthening. And I think we never envisaged a period when the conventions that underpin public life in Britain were going to prove so fragile, and that we never thought we would see people just saying that these conventions really don't matter, I'm not going to abide by them. And that does raise big questions about what we now do. If I could just, I mean, the assumption was, when this committee was established, as I say, in 1994, initially the assumption was that what it said would be done, and that is what happened. That's why we had the party political reforms and all the rest of it, that and the strengthening the parliamentary standards and so on. But the assumption was that if the Committee on Standards in Public Life said this should happen, that it would happen. With respect, I don't think that's the case anymore. I think it can safely be ignored, is safely ignored. There are no consequences for ignoring it. And that does make you have to think, what do we now do? If we find, on the one hand, that conventions are not working in the way that they did, if we find that bodies that were supposed to help us with all this are not being taken as seriously as they once were, what does that mean? I mean, I might just give you at some point an idea of what I think.
That's very interesting, because I think it's certainly the case that at least for the last 15 years, some of the recommendations of this committee have not been adopted. So that suggests that this is not an altogether a new thing that's happened in the last, during the tensions and pressures of the last 2 or 3 years. But you feel that there's been a sea change in terms of the willingness of government to take these issues seriously?
Oh, I think on a whole range of issues. I mean, whether it's proroguing Parliament or trying to prevent it doing its job, whether it's allegations of jobs for the boys, cronyism, whether it's allegations of money being used in a bipartisan way, contracts being given to friends, and now it seems the complete disregard of the ministerial code. Now that is I think when that happens, you've crossed a line. I think when you reach a point, I mean, there's been stay with the ministerial code for a moment. I mean, this is a story of evolution. I mean, it began simply as a sort of set of notes for ministers issued by a prime minister. It used to be called Question and Procedure for Ministers. Now it's elevated into a code, quite rightly, because actually the conduct of ministers is fundamental to the political system, and they should not do the things that are prescribed in the code. But then tacked onto that was the idea that, well, who's going to investigate these allegations of code breaking? And so we tacked on an advisor. But the advisor, I mean, has a very curious status. It can't take things on unilaterally. I don't think anybody envisaged that such an advisor would come to a finding, and that finding would be completely disregarded by the Prime Minister of the day, as though it just didn't matter. I mean, I think that fundamentally does matter. So then you have to think, well, what do we do about that? Do we just say, oh, well, that's politics, that's how these things works? Or do we say, look, this means that there's got to be some serious strengthening of this system so this doesn't happen again? I haven't thought through the implications of that, but I think you've got to, and I think you've got to think something should happen to this regulatory mechanism, and something should happen when its findings are disregarded, whether that's a parliamentary motion or whatever, but it needs to be something that happens.
We'll come on in more detail to the ministerial code in particular and its enforcement as we go on, but We've got a very complex landscape of standards regulators at the moment, some of which have statutory power, some of which are administrative only, and some of which have stronger or less strong independent elements. Do you think that that complexity is a strength in the sense that you have tailored arrangements for particular institutions, or do you think that it's a weakness of the particular system that we have in this country?
Well, I think it's a good thing that we've developed these mechanisms, and you can imagine a world without them, and that wasn't so very long ago, really. You called it, I think, in your opening remarks, a complex tapestry. I would say it's a bit of a mess, and that the time has come, and I think these recent examples that we sort of mentioning, I think we've reached a point where we just have to say, well, look, we've got to take stock of this in some way. I mean, I know that you do that, and the committee that I chaired did it, and you can go through all the mechanisms, all the bodies, and you can assess them in terms of certain criteria: independence, accountability, funding, appointment, all the rest of it, and to see whether there's any consistency here. It's very hard to come to the conclusion that there is. I mean, why are some advisory? Why are some statutory? Why are some funded by this? Why some sponsored by that? This is why I said earlier on that my feeling is that we have to sort of do something now and try and pull all this together into some sort of overall form. We floated, as you know, in a report that we did in, I think, 2007, the idea of a public standards commission that would try to do this. And I still think, well, I think even more so now, although we were a bit fluffy about what it actually meant, I think even more so now that the time, I mean, if as we said just a few minutes ago, that these conduct matters, these ethical matters are fundamental to any system of government, I think that has to be reflected in the machinery that we have. And I've just thinking about this for this session, I've come to the view now that we really do need something that you might call an integrity commission on a statutory basis, with a defined range of tasks to make sure that that all these bodies were coherent, that they did have the tools to do the job, that there weren't any gaps, that there weren't any overlaps, that could bring forward proposals, sometimes legislative, could produce an annual report on integrity in government. So it would be a statutory body concerned with this whole area, and as I say, owned by Parliament. And I think that would be a big breakthrough. I don't see it happening.
Would you see its remit very specifically aimed at, or what would its remit be? Would it be for government? Would it be for government and Parliament? Would it be for the civil service? Would it be for the wider public sector? Or what might be the limits of this new body?
I think its remit would be all those issues that bear upon standards in government. It wouldn't get into constitutional issues. It wouldn't get into things of a different kind. This is all conduct. It's all integrity. And as you say, we have this now range of bodies all set up in a rather ad hoc way, different purposes, sometimes in response to a crisis or a scandal. So we've got all this stuff, but there's no sense that it hangs together, or that anybody's keeping an eye on the, I mean, I know the committee does its best to do this, and it does landscape reviews and so on, but to do it in a way that's muscular, robust, and has some statute behind it, and that would be an indication that these things are taken extremely seriously, and that the integrity arm of government is as fundamental as any other arm of government.
And would that include local government and so on, or would you delimit it? Would you include the National Health Service? Would you include the police? Where would you see the boundary for that sort of role?
I had assumed we were talking about central government. My thoughts would develop, but I assumed we were talking about central government.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Shirley Pearce.
Shirley.
Thank you very much. Just to absolutely check, this Integrity Commission would look at central government. Do you mean just government, Parliament? What's it?
No, I think all those areas where integrity matters. So yes, of course, I think under that, I see it as a kind of umbrella under which would shelter all these bodies, whether in their existing form or in a reformed shape. Make sure that they could do their job, could be there to respond to I mean, you take the Electoral Commission. I mean, everyone knows the Electoral Commission has to do a fundamental review of funding, party funding in an internet age. I mean, dark money, all that. It knows it's got to reform electoral law in a way as fundamental as it was done a century ago when these things were first put in place. Yet the talk is of abolishing the Electoral Commission instead of now somebody has to have the ability, I think, armed with statute, to be able to say, actually, this needs to be done, and it will be done. And you've got some protection then for bodies like that, which they don't have at the moment. At the moment, because as we all know, we have a very executive-driven system. If the executive wants to abolish these bodies, it can do on a whim. So, this is a very precarious basis for a system of standards enforcement within government.
Okay, that's very helpful, clear. You have, I think, in the past felt that the standards regulators should be answerable to Parliament and should be accountable to Parliament. Is that still your view? And if so, you just say a little bit more about why.
Well, I think one of the questions is, who are they accountable to? And it seems to me that at least Parliament's role in relation to all of these should be up for examination. For example, in relation to the ministerial code, although that's issued by the Prime Minister of the day, it seems to me that it also ought to be owned by Parliament, because this is, I mean, if Parliament is the central accountability body, it has to be accountable. It has to make sure that ministers are accountable to it for how it behaves. So I would think in relation to a number of these bodies, where does Parliament sit, and to make it sit rather more prominently than it does at the moment.
And with the people appointed to lead those groups answerable to Parliament themselves too.
Yes, I think that would be a natural part of the process. There's nothing threatening about that. I mean, your committee and its chairs used regularly to come and give evidence to our committee, and we felt we were in the same business, and we felt we were sort of self-reinforcing. And I think we all know that the structure can be, I mean, it can be, whichever bit you take, I think there are questions about it. And I think we somehow need to bring all this into some sort of coherent shape.
And the Integrity Commission that you propose, which you think should be on a statutory footing, would that also apply to, would you also feel more comfortable if the standards regulators were also on a statutory footing? whatever one
I
is.
think,
If you do a landscape review and change it all a bit,
yeah,
what you come up with, should they be on a statutory footing too?
I think you would look at each one and say, is the present arrangement satisfactory? Should an advisory body be an advisory body, or should it be more than an advisory body? I think there's a feeling of I mean, you take, I haven't got any detailed recent knowledge, but you take the Business Appointments Committee. I mean, I don't think anybody, rightly or wrongly, anybody believes in the credibility of that organisation. I don't think they think the rules are robust enough. Don't they think there's any enforcement of any serious kind? It's all a bit amateurish and ad hoc. Shouldn't be chaired, in my view, by a former senior politician. I think it should be robustly independent. And I think you probably would put it onto a statutory basis because it's important. I mean, the traffic between government and the outside world, I think, is a big issue, particularly now that public and private intermeshes in the way that it does. And when I see, I know this is ad hominem and gratuitous, but when I see the committee saying to a former chancellor, someone who was chancellor just last year, oh yes, of course you can go off and work for JP Morgan. And of course, yes, they can pay you £150,000 a year. And of course, by the way, you're not going to lobby your former colleagues, are you? I just find this extraordinary. I mean, the committee's terms of reference are it talks about helping ministers find a new career or return to old careers. I mean, this person is still a member of Parliament. I mean, getting £80,000 a year. And yet the committee thinks that it's perfectly all right to go off and work for lots of other people at the same time. I think most people would be baffled by this. And I think that's just an example of where I think you just have to take these things in hand and say, is this actually what we want? Yeah. Can't we put it onto a more robust footing?
Yeah. I think probably we'll come back to Aqaba in a bit later on, but that's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. I'll hand on to Jane.
Okay, thank you. Hello, Tony. Hi. Can I take you back to the ministerial code then, just in a bit more detail, if that's okay? I mean, do you think, because you've got a long span of looking at how these things have worked over a number of years. So do you think the ministerial code has generally done the job that it was intended for, and it's only recently falling down? Or is there something else going on?
I think it's grown in significance over the years. Again, I remember it being a big deal when John Major published it. You have to remember it began life simply as Clement Attlee issuing this sort of set of notes to ministers on how they should conduct themselves. Quite brief. Over the years, it has grown. It has grown in size. It has grown in significance to become what it now says is a ministerial code, and it covers much of the stuff that you would want to see covered. So now I think you have to say that's its status. It's become a central conduct document of government against which you can measure things. But I don't think anyone's thought through, as I was saying earlier on, we've seen that from recent events, exactly how it's going to operate. How are allegations of misconduct against ministers to be investigated? Who's to do them? Can they initiate investigations of their own kind? And what happens when their recommendations are rejected? I don't think anybody's thought about this.
And so it feels from what you're saying like there's at the very least quite a lot of catching up to be done. And for many people, the catching up is largely to do with the independence. And you've already, hinted at this. So, the independent advisor being able to initiate their own investigations. Perhaps the independent advisor needs to have more protection in terms of office, etc. Sort of a single renewable term, for example. Could the independent advisor have more say over, when a breach was a breach, and then it was be up to the Prime Minister to then sort of act on that. I mean, from what you know now, would you agree that greater independence would be a step in the right direction?
Well, as you probably know, I mean, our committee argued this year in, year out. So, I mean, we sort of saw all this coming, and we it was pretty obvious at some point you're going to have to hit these issues. It seemed to be an advance to have an advisor established, but there again, the very word advisor is very curious in this situation too. I mean, it suggests a sort of gentle word with the Prime Minister as to whether lines have been crossed. In fact, if the code has been breached, that's pretty important stuff, and you need somebody who, rather like you have with a parliamentary commissioner of standards, that you have a standards person to investigate that, who's got the ability to come to findings, report those findings, yes, to the Prime Minister, but also to Parliament.
Sure. And the sort of final area about the role of the Prime Minister. I mean, we all understand the constitutional role of the Prime Minister, but in relation to the ministerial code, at the moment, as you've just said, the advisor only advises, the Prime Minister decides, the Prime Minister has sole authority on sanctions, and as of course, has happened, then the Prime Minister decides whether a breach has been declared or not. What do we do about that? Because you've talked about ethics being fundamental to democracy, but at the same time, some might say, well, yeah, but we don't want a system which restrains the activities of a democratically elected government. So, is there a line to be drawn, and what would you have to say about that?
Well, it depends how important you think standards matters are, and how important it is to be consistent and robust with them. You can't take the politics out of this. I mean, I sat in the Commons for many years, and there were always allegations that ministers had broken the ministerial code in some way or another. And this was before we had an advisor on interests. Eventually, the Prime Minister of the day, who owns at the moment this code, decides what to do. Now, sometimes ministers were disposed of, and sometimes you hung on to them, and you generally try to hang on to them. But we've now moved from that to having someone who does the investigation and comes to a finding, publicly known finding. It's at that point, I say, you've moved into different territory. A Prime Minister may still want to keep a minister who's been found to break the ministerial code, but that shouldn't happen. I'm not saying that every breach should mean resignation. That's the other part of all this. I think you'd want some sort of graduated system. You might have to go and stand on the naughty step for a while before you can come back. So it's not. People always think it means just resignation or sacking, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. I mean, I think in bad cases it should, but there are other cases possibly where, as I say, some other action might be necessary. But all this needs to be systematized. It's not at the moment.
Yeah.
And now we see, I mean, I think, as I say, I don't think we ever thought that you would have a situation where you had a formal finding from a serious investigator that was simply discarded and said, you may say that, but I'm doing nothing about it.
Sure. Thank you. That's those are all the questions from me. Thank you very much. Lord Stunlow.
Well, we've covered some fascinating stuff, but I'd just like to move on to public appointments and the operation of COBA, and just, if you like, play devil's advocate and say, hasn't it always been like this? Governments have always wanted to see their people in the right places, and all that's happening now is people are noticing more. Would you like to reflect perhaps on your time as committee chair and time in Parliament as to whether you think there's been an evolution in this, a worsening of this, a change in this?
Well, it's a good question, and when I was a recently elected member of Parliament in the 90s, I got very interested in public appointment because I thought, the charge at the time was that the government of the day were putting their people into all kinds of appointments, and I did some research on this, and I recommended that there should be a public appointments commission that would do this job. It's more complicated, and I thought it was rather simple then. It's actually more complicated than that. You have to decide the extent to which ministers are entitled to appoint their own people to jobs. It has to be done through a proper process. And I know that Peter Riddell has been warning that this process is not working as it should, because the system is being bent to ensure that certain candidates come through, and that means looking at the real independence of the independent element in this process. I don't think the ministers should be prevented from appointing people that they want to jobs, as long as it's been through a proper process and as long as people are properly competent. The exception I would make is in the area of ethical regulation. See, I think this is quite different. I can see a minister is entitled to say, look, I've got a policy objective. I want people in public bodies in that area who share my policy objective, so we can get this thing moving. As long as the process is done properly and the independent element works properly, I think that's probably okay. But I think when it comes to appointing people to ethical regulatory bodies, that is, people whose job is to keep an eye on the conduct of ministers and government itself, I don't think that should be a ministerial appointment at all. It just seems to be quite wrong, and that I think that some sort of independent commission should be responsible for those. At the moment, these names go up, and the minister will choose, and they can veto people. They can get people that they want. I think for these ethical regulatory roles, I think then that is not acceptable for ministers to appoint those.
Yes. Would you? The regulatory role, would you extend that to Ofwat and Ofcom and all the things which start with off, or are you thinking of a narrower range of?
No, I don't think those are ethical regulators. They are regulators, but they're not ethical regulators.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think the previous observation applies. As long as the person appointed to such role has gone through the proper process. And the reason why I think the Commissioner for Public Appointments is raising some concerns about this is when he reads in the paper that a certain person is going to become the chair of Ofcom, for example. Now, that clearly is quite wrong, because the chair of Ofcom should emerge from a process of proper appointment.
Yes. There's a different evil there, isn't there? That it's frightening off plausible candidates from applying if they know that other person, it's just a false process. Clearly, wrong.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the example there was the BBC, which doesn't have a regulatory role, or indeed the student czar, whatever the title was. So I'm just trying to establish in my mind a little bit more clearly what you see as a difference between a regulatory function on government, which bodies those are, and regulatory functions in general, just so that I've clarified.
Well, I think all the bodies that if we started making a list of ethical regulators, we've mentioned some of them today. I mean, the ones whose job it is to keep an eye on government and maintain standards in government. Whether it's electoral commission or business appointments or whatever. I mean, I think the ones that are concerned with ethical regulation, that is the conduct of government, conduct of ministers, including this committee, by the way, I think these should not be ministerial appointments. They should not be political appointments. They have to be, by their very nature, independent. And I think that's it's pretty obvious what these ethical regulators are, and we've talked about the complex tapestry that they represent. Yeah.
Well, we've got a former Secretary of State who's chairing a COBA at the moment, and that might be an illustration of what you're talking about. Yes,
I mentioned that I think earlier on, and I think that seems to be quite wrong. I mean, shall I get into trouble now? I mean, I think it's quite wrong. I think it's quite wrong that there are serving politicians who are members of your committee. And I think it's quite wrong. It's quite wrong that the Electoral Commission reports to a committee of the House of Commons. It's quite wrong that the funding of IPSA is controlled by a House of Commons committee, so that politicians can keep their eye on what's going on. I mean, I just think these should be fundamentally independent institutions, because their business is to keep an eye on what governments and politicians do, and they should not be beholden to them.
Thank you very much. If we move on to look at the others that are legitimate, in your view, legitimate areas for the government to play a role and to have a part, what do you think the balance should be between ministerial control of the process and having a fair and open competition?
Well, we've got, as I say, I used to think that all these public appointments should really be appointed independently, and shouldn't be in the control of ministers. I think I take a more generous view now, which is, as I said a moment ago, that in these policy areas, I can quite see that if I was a minister, I would, if possible, want to get someone running these bodies under my remit that broadly in line with my policy objectives, and I thought was going to be vigorous in pursuit of them, but with the proviso that the proper process is gone through, which is that there is a proper panel, that the independent element is strong enough, that the people who come through are vouchsafed for competence, that the presumption is that the minister will choose one or other of the candidates put forward on that basis. So I think it's when the worries start being expressed that process is not challenging the role of ministers to be the final decider for those things, but it's when people say the process is not working properly, then I think we should get concerned.
Okay, well, finally, can I just ask a question about the revolving door issue for people going in and out of government into private and related interests? Do you think that that's safeguarded sufficiently? Are there steps that you would want to see reinforced or changed in order to have a process that would satisfy you on the integrity front?
Well, my view, I think I said earlier on, is that I don't think people have any confidence in that system. I'm not saying anything against the people involved in it. I'm sure they're trying to do a decent job, but I think the function is so important and the traffic between government and outside is so important that it needs to be policed properly. I think the rules need looking at. My own view is that some of them need strengthening. I think the length of time between taking up appointments should be longer than it probably is. The assumption should be there should be a very decent length of time. I think the enforcement and the constitution of the body doing it, which I say I think I'd probably put on a proper footing in statute, because it's important. I mean, the whole thing is an example of just having sort of made it up as you go along. And I think the time has probably come to take it all in hand.
Well, it was a crisis response at the time, as so many of these measures are. And you could say that the rules are that there's no rules, in that clearly a COBA takes a decision based on the merits of the case. What would you see as being the merits of the case? You would want to prevent ministers moving into related employment for a much longer period, or some other constraints placed on them?
I think in some cases I wouldn't allow it at all. In some cases I would have a much longer normal period. I think that the traffic seems to be too quick and too easy. And the example I gave, I think, is an example of that. I mean, I do find it astonishing that someone can be a Chancellor of the Exchequer one day and go off and be a consultant to a bank the next day. It seems to me that there is something wrong with the system that can allow that to happen. So I think, my sense is, along with the sense of other people, this is a system in need of some serious reform.
Yeah, with a COBA given some enforcement powers to enforce a decision that they've taken, or
I think you'd have to have some enforcement. Otherwise, no point having a system. It would have to be properly enforced. I worry about it. A lot of this. I worry about. This is a different topic, but I worry about the way in which members of Parliament, despite what I said about the reaction to the formation of this committee in 1994, the ease with which members of Parliament can still engage in many other well-paid activities, as well as being members of Parliament. I think that needs to be revisited. I think most people think that being a member of Parliament is a job. It's not a sort of thing that you just do as a sort of holding along with other holdings. And now that they're paid a proper professional salary, I think the assumption is that they will do a proper professional job. So I think we need to revisit that. We need to revisit the enforcement powers that the Commissioner for Standards has. Still, that remains unsatisfactory, despite I think what this committee has said in the past and others. So there's no shortage of work to be done for my Integrity Commission.
Certainly right. And I'm just aware that you have an appointment. I think this is perhaps an appropriate moment for me to hand back to Lord Evans.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for that evidence. I know you've got a hard stop. I think we've got 1 minute, so I'm going to take the opportunity. We've seen a number of steps over the last couple of years where issues that might traditionally have been seen as standards issues, or even to some extent sort of constitutional issues, have come before the courts, and the courts effectively have become an enforcement body for issues that were not previously justiciable or seen as justiciable. Do you think that's a desirable process, or does it point to a weakness elsewhere?
Yeah, well, the short answer is despite being a constitutional reformer and a political reformer, I've always been rather old-fashioned in thinking that there was a good deal to be said for a a flexible constitution, and in many ways a political constitution where things are decided politically rather than judicially. And I would like still to believe that. The problem comes, as we've seen in recent times, that if governments, I mean, for that to work, you've got to have agreement about the conventions that you will follow for these things to work politically. If you reach a point where these conventions don't work or are simply being broken, I'm afraid you will then get into the arena of thinking about whether these things will be decided elsewhere. Now, I think that would be an unwelcome development, but I think it's a natural consequence of the flouting of conventions, which in all kinds of ways underpins our system.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. We very much appreciate it, and you bring a very helpful and challenging perspective. So thank you very much indeed.